Morning, guys. I'm here. Sorry about being a couple minutes late. The Zoom account was having trouble with my password, so I had to call the college to reset it. But I'm getting going right now. I'm letting people drop into the meeting as we speak. So people are still joining the meeting. Just give me a minute. Thanks. All right. So we are recording. I just want to remind you that you can rewatch these mini lectures as often as you'd like. What I do is after I have these, later within the next 24 hours, I'll post it to the Canvas page. So where I want to begin is where we left off last time, which is the end of chapter 1. Before I go any further, this is a little bit of a disclaimer. These mini lectures are not they're not intended to take the place of you reading the chapters. They're supposed to supplement and help you understand the material. So just so you know, I can't possibly cover every single word of these chapters. We'd be in Zoom meetings all day long. So what I do is I hit the most important points as clearly as I can. If you have any questions, feel free to email, okay? All right, so where we left off was the end of chapter 1 and a section called anatomical body language or anatomical language. And these terms, so I'm looking at my textbook right now. There's a whole figure, a diagram of surface body landmarks on the human body. It is imperative that you learn this language, because if you go on to do anything in healthcare or frankly, anything that has to do with anatomy and physiology, it will be important that you can speak this language. That's why we have to learn it now, early in the game, and you'll just get better and better at it as you go on in life, especially if you're going to be in healthcare. So I don't have time to go through every single surface body landmark that's on the figure. There's a diagram in your book. In my book, I have a older edition. There's a male figure. It doesn't matter if it's male or female. There's a human figure facing forward and one facing backwards that has all these body landmarks on it. And we use this language, these landmarks, in order to be able to communicate with each other. For example, in the head region, we call that whole region cephalic. So cephalic means head, but within the head, there are surface body landmarks like cranial, top of the head, frontal, which means forehead, nasal, buccal for cheek, oral for mouth, otic or otic for ear. All of these things it's just a language. That's all it is. It's just renaming what you and I would call body parts. And the reason for that is so that we can communicate with one another. For example, in the arm, the acromial region is the shoulder region up here. The axillary region is the armpit region. And then as you go down the arm, the upper arm is brachial. The crux of the elbow is antecubital. The forearm is antebrachial. So if I'm out in the field, say, for example, either an EMT, an emergency worker, and I'm trying to communicate with somebody at a healthcare center like a hospital, and I say, oh, somebody's been cut, they're bleeding profusely, I can tell the person in the left brachial region, or it looks like their left brachial artery was severed. That person on the other end of the communication line knows exactly where I mean. I don't just say, oh, they're bleeding from their left arm somewhere. I can be more specific. So if I say brachial, that person knows the upper arm. So I would like you to review all of those body landmarks.
I have a question.
Yeah.
It's not about the chapter, but for the labs that are due, are they just like the exercises you posted with like the 60 questions on them?
Yeah, so the lab exercises that you're going to be expected to complete by the due date, I specifically put those in the modules. So
okay.
What you're required to do is only what shows up in the module on the Canvas course page, okay?
Okay, thank you.
So I've already posted exercises for module 1 and module 2.
Yeah.
All of those exercises are due February 1st by midnight.
Okay.
Okay?
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. So moving on to the last of this chapter 1, they go over body planes and sections. So you need to read that and review that. This book only lists 3 major planes cutting through the human body. And I'll go in the order of your book. That's median, frontal, and transverse. So you need to know what a median section or plane means, and that is cutting through a human or a body, what you and I would call vertically. So there are different names used for the same thing, unfortunately, in A&P. So a sagittal cut, S-A-G-I-T-T-A-L, sagittal means anything vertically up and down. A mid-sagittal or median cutter plane means right in the middle, dividing a person into a right and left half. A frontal or coronal plane would be if you did a vertical cut and the person was standing sideways to you, separating the person into an anterior and posterior half, or front and back half. And finally, a transverse planar cut would be going this way, right where your belt line is, separating a person into a superior and inferior pieces. So I do want you to know the names of those planes, and like I said, what types of sections they leave that person in. So I'm going to ask you questions on the first quiz. For example, the following section or plane cuts a person into a superior and inferior body part, and that would be a transverse plane. Frontal cuts it into anterior, posterior. Mid-sagittal or median plane separates a person into a right and left section. And please review the body cavities. There's just that this is not rocket science. It's just looking at a diagram and seeing what a dorsal body cavity is, a ventral body cavity, and know that the cranial and spinal cord is included in the dorsal, and things like the thoracic and abdominal cavities are included in the ventral and the pelvic cavity. And last but not least, there's a diagram in my textbook. It may or may not be the same as yours. It's figure 1.11. I would like you to review the 9 regions delineated by 4 planes. And what that shows you, so I'm going to share my screen here. There's a diagram in your book of a human torso, and it gets divided into 9 regions. And basically what happens is we just draw a tic-tac-toe board like this, and we number these regions 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then all of these regions have names given to them. And it would take me too long to write them all out. They can be found in figure 1.11 A, I believe, and it just lists these 9 regions. So pay attention to these 9 regions, and I will ask you questions like the umbilical region is blank to the hypogastric region. This is the umbilical region, and here's the hypogastric region. So the umbilical region is superior, it's above the hypogastric region. That enables me to ask you questions, including all types of anatomical language. You have to know what superior and inferior means, and you have to know where these regions lie. So one one more example type of question. This is to help you study. One more example type of question would be the left iliac region, which is here. We're talking about this person's left and right side, not yours. So the left iliac region, say, is what to the hypogastric region? And it's lateral because it's off to the side. So the left iliac region and the right iliac region are lateral to this hypogastric region, which would be medial. Medial means toward the middle, lateral means away from the side. All of this is in chapter 1. You can just read the chapter and you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. So those are examples of questions that I can determine if you have learned this language. All right, I want to spend most of this mini lecture beginning chapter 4. And I'm going to get through as much of chapter 4 as I can. I'm just dropping another student in. As much of chapter 4 as I can, both today and Thursday. Remember, your quiz on Monday is over chapters 1 and chapter 4. So let's move on to chapter 4. And that is about human tissues. So first, I'm just going to quickly define what a tissue is. And that is a group of cells. That's all it is a group of cells similar in structure that provide a common function. So remember, in the levels of organization, it goes chemical, cellular, tissue levels. So we're at this level of organization, and it's basically just a group of cells similar in structure that group together to perform or provide a specific function or similar function. There's 4 main types of tissue in the human body, and they are epithelial, connective, muscular, and nervous. And I'll try my best to get through all 4 of these and some speak about tissue repair this week. If I don't get to all of it, you're still responsible to read it in the textbook, okay? These are the 4 major types. All tissues in the human body belong to one of these 4. These cover and surfaces and line cavities. This is the big beast. This is the most difficult one to study because it's the most varied and the most diverse. Muscular, we'll list the 3 types. We're not going to study these 2 in great detail at this point. The reason is because we study the muscular system and the nervous system later in the semester. We will study, I'm going to use red, we will study this one a lot and this one a lot this week. These last 2 we will just mention, muscular and nervous, and give some fun facts about them before it's over. So let's just start right off the bat with epithelial tissue. These tissues, all epithelial tissues, cover surfaces and line cavities. So they're really just for covering surfaces, either inside or out. That's what they do. That's their function. Just still dropping students in here. So there are main characteristics. Before we get into individual tissues, there are overall characteristics of epithelial tissues. I already said that they cover surfaces. I'm going to go over the 5 main characteristics. The first one is polarity. All that word means is differences on one side of a membrane from another. So epithelial tissues exhibit a characteristic of polarity, which just means the environment is different on one side than it is on the other side. Second major characteristic, I'm going in the order of your book. Your book lists special contacts. I'll be more specific. So epithelial tissues typically have very close knitted fitting cells that are tightly woven together so that these cells have tight junctions that don't allow a lot of things to pass through those seams. So the cells, for example, are very tightly knitted together, oftentimes in a row like this. Special contacts is referring to this tight cell-to-cell junction right there. And they use a protein called desmosomes. That's a protein to provide for that tight junction. I'm going to blow up my picture here. If there's a cell and there's a cell, there are protein anchors called desmosomes that literally bind those two cells together. Third characteristic is typically epithelial tissue is supported by connective tissue. There's almost always some sort of connective tissue involved with epithelial tissue. And it's really to provide something for this epithelial surface to attach to, usually the basal surface, what's deep to it down here. 4, major characteristic, all epithelial tissues are avascular. That means that they lack a direct blood supply. And finally, number 5, a high capability of regeneration. That means they are highly mitotic. There's a lot of cellular division going on in them. We can almost always, epithelial tissues can be replaced. So I'm writing highly mitotic. Mitosis, as you know from Bio 1, is just a form of cellular regeneration or cellular replication. Just think of your skin. It sloughs off and gets scraped off all the time, every day. There are stem cells deep in your skin, for example, which is a type of epithelial tissue. There are stem cells that are constantly dividing and giving rise to new cells. So those are the 5 major characteristics that your book lists about epithelial tissues. Now I'm going to get more specific and talk about the structure of epithelial tissue. So we're still just talking about number 1, epithelial. Just going with structure, and then in parentheses, classification. Different types of epithelial tissue can be classified, and they're based on 2 factors. Classification, how we put them into groups, is based on 2 factors. The first one is cell shape. And the second is the number of layers of cells. So when we talk about shape of epithelial tissues, just to remind you, we're talking about epithelial. We have just basically 3 categories that we can use for shape. Those 3 categories are the word, some people say squamous. I was taught to say squamous. Doesn't matter how you pronounce it as long as you know how it's written. Squamous. That means flat. So the shape of squamous cells are flat cells. Just think of pancakes. Then we have cuboidal. Those are cube, just like the name says, they're box-like or cube-shaped cells. And finally, columnar. You can see the word column in there. These are tall, column-shaped cells. All right? So that tells you the 3 choices of cell shape. Number of layers is even easier. Number of layers, we have either simple, which means 1 layer, or stratified, that word just means more than 1 layer. So we're going to classify all epithelial tissues using these 2 criteria: shape of cells and number of layers. Now we're just going to go through the types of epithelial tissue quickly in the human body, and we're going to categorize them, name them based on these two criteria, and we're going to list some characteristics about them. So first thing I'm going to do is a group of simple epithelial tissues, okay? So I'm going to write the word simple. I'm just going to list these. The first one, simple squamous epithelial. My writing is so poor on this board because I'm writing with a plastic pen on a glass surface. It's very difficult. Now we know from our criteria what this is. One layer of flat cells that covers or lines a surface. So we know what it is. I'm just going to list locations. This is what I want you to know specifically of these individual tissues. Locations, functions. So there are lots of locations. I'm just going to give you a few. Simple squamous epithelial tissue typically is found in places where things have to easily move from one side of that tissue to the other. So locations would be the inside of the mouth, lining our blood vessels. It's a very thin, it's only one layer thick. So if we look at it from the side, from a lateral view, it looks like this. And it's just one cell layer thick. So things easily move through this tissue from one side to the other. And we find this in the mouth, lining our vessels, in the alveoli of our lungs, in the female reproductive tract, specifically lining the female vagina. Actually, I think that, wait, that's stratified squamous. So let's just do mouth, vessels, and alveoli. This one's for protection. The functions of this are diffusion and filtration. Those two words are almost the same, and they refer to these arrows I've drawn, things moving across this membrane. So lining our mouth is this thin wall of cells. The vessels and alveoli in our lungs are also very thinly lined with this tissue. Let's go to number 2, simple cuboidal epithelium. This means a single layer of cube-shaped cells that lines a surface or covers a surface. We find this stuff typically in the thyroid gland. I'm just giving you some examples. In the kidneys, I'm going to write kidney tubules. And functions are things like absorption, and secretion. Now these words, these functional words, they almost all sound the same. Diffusion, filtration, absorption, secretion. They're slightly different. So this would be a single layer of box-like looking cells that cover a surface or line a surface. A single layer. Absorption literally means moving across this membrane like we did up here, only it's for a different purpose. It's for absorbing something like nutrition or reabsorbing in the kidney. We reabsorb constituents that we don't want to get rid of in our urine. Secretion literally means this cell itself produces some sort of a secretion and then releases it That's what secretion means. And third on our simple list are simple columnar epithelial tissues. That means a single layer of tall column-shaped cells that also line or cover a surface. For locations, we find this typically lining the digestive system. So all the way, I'm just going to list some organs. Stomach, I'm going to write intestines. That means all three sections of the small intestine as well as the large intestine. And then in general, I'm just going to write GI tract. That's the most common place we find this, is that stands for gastrointestinal tract. So think digestive system. We have one layer of tall cells all in a row like this that line our GI tract. So this would be the inside of the intestine where our food products are. And the functions of this are mostly absorption and some secretion as well. So we've ingested nutrition, we've chewed it up, we've broken down the food that we've eaten. We have to get those nutrients across the wall of our intestine and into our bloodstream. So that act of going from here across this wall and into our blood is called absorption. Secretion is just like I listed above. That means these cells themselves also have the abilities to secrete things. In this case, it's a mucus-like fluid. All right, so that takes care of the simple epithelial tissues. I'm going to go on now to the stratifieds. And we'll list them. I'm going to try to go in the order of your book. Stratified squamous epithelium. You know what this is now because we've defined it. More than one layer of flat cells that covers a surface. Locations, I was incorrect with my simple stratified, so I'm going to put female reproductive tract. Actually, this stuff also lines the inside of the mouth as well. We find this at entrances and exits to the body. So the anus, where digestive waste leaves the body. So most entry points and exit points to the human body are lined with this tissue because its main function is protection. Let's add the skin. The outer layers, the epithelial layers of the skin are stratified squamous epithelium. It looks like this. This is called the basement membrane that glues the cells down to it. And it's relatively flat cells, but it's multiple layers. And we find this stuff at entrances and exits to the body, as well as covering our body in the form of skin, because it's multiple, sometimes up to 30 to 40 cell layers thick. And so that provides a lot of protection against things like abrasion. Next on the list, stratified cuboidal. I'm going to mix these two together. I'm going to combine these two together. Stratified cuboidal and columnar. Not just to save time, but also because these are relatively rare. Up until now, the epithelial tissues that I've specifically covered are usually quite common, and they're found in multiple locations, as we've already noted. So I'm just going to write the word rare. We don't find either of these types of tissues very often in the human body. They're not common. They are typically found in, getting ahead of myself there, in ducts, D-U-C-T-S, which just means tubes. Of large glands, specifically the male reproductive system, and female mammary glands. And also finally sweat glands as well. So male reproductive system, female mammary glands, and sweat glands typically contain, but that's pretty much the only place we find them. And not all sweat glands have this type of tissue. So just to draw you a quick picture, it just means multiple layers of cube-shaped cells, complex sweat glands, the male reproductive system, like the ductus deferens, prostate gland, things like that. Or if it's stratified columnar, there's multiple layers of these tall column-shaped cells, and their typical function is secretion. These cells secrete some sort of fluid, either breast milk in mammary glands, some sort of perspiration or sweat, or from the male reproductive system, it might be prostatic fluid or semen. The semen is just a combination of all different secretions from the male reproductive glands. I'm going to call up a new whiteboard and talk about two more epithelial tissues: transitional epithelium. This is a special tissue that doesn't really fall into the category of either simple or stratified, and I'll tell you why. First, its location. We only find this in the urinary system. I'm going to write urinary tract. Things like the urinary bladder is lined with this type of tissue. The ureters they're the tubes that lead from the urinary bladder to the urethra, or from the kidneys to the urinary bladder. So in these tubes and in the bladder itself, we find these cells that when the tissue is relaxed, so if I have the urinary bladder, it's just a big sac. The inside lining of the bladder is what we're talking about inside in here, okay? So now I'm going to blow that up. And the cells, when the bladder is empty, are these round, plump cells like this. And they literally look like it's a stratified layer, and they're all piled up on top of each other. But when the urinary bladder fills with fluid, these cells have the ability to stretch. And so when this cavity fills with fluid in here, the wall of the bladder distends or stretches, and these cells then get stretched out. They slide past one another and they get stretched out like this, almost becoming a simple or single layer of tissues. So the location is the urinary, things in the urinary system. Function, I'm going to write one word, is distension. That means the ability to stretch. That's supposed to be an N. D-I-S-T-E-N-S-I-O-N. I'll write the word stretch. Only in the urinary system. It's a good question. The stomach is lined with that simple columnar epithelial cells only. So it's a good point that you make. Yes, the stomach wall does have the ability to distend a little bit, but not nearly as much as the urinary bladder. Urinary bladder has a much higher degree of ability to do that stretching. All right, so that was a special category. And here's the last special category. It is pseudo-stratified. It's a long name, but it tells us exactly what it is. Columnar epithelium. Okay, let's define this first. This pseudo means false or fake. Stratified means more than one layer. So this, we know what columnar means, tall cells that line a surface. So this is really a tissue, a group of cells that looks like it's stratified, but it really is not. It's fake or false. So I'm just going to call up a new whiteboard to give me more space. Let's do our locations and functions first. Respiratory system is where we largely find this stuff. So I'm going to list a few of those structures. Trachea is the most common. And the version in the trachea is ciliated. That just means that the cells have those little hair-like structures on them. If that's a cell, a ciliated cell has this little, it almost looks like a flagellum, but it's not used for locomotion, so we call it a cilia. Main function is secretion of mucus specifically, but it also assists with the movement of debris. Now I'm going to explain on my next page what that means. I'll show you what it looks like, and then I'll kind of show you how it functions. So let's move over to a new board. I'm going to draw that pseudo-stratified columnar epithelial cells. These are cells that are tall, hence the name columnar, but they are, it looks like a hodgepodge of cells like this. So it makes us think that it's more than one layer. When we look at it under a microscope, it kind of looks like this. The nuclei, the nucleus you can see in each of these individual cells. They have in the trachea, particularly, there are cilia on these cells that line the respiratory tract. The reason it's called pseudostratified, or that it is pseudostratified, is because each of these individual cells has some sort of extension that goes down and touches this basement membrane, the basal surface. So each of these cells really technically goes down and touches this basal membrane. Sometimes it's called a basement membrane. So these cells, the main function of them, as we noted, is secretion. So these cells that line our windpipe are constantly secreting mucus into the cavity of the trachea. And the cilia help move debris that gets into our airways. So we get dust and debris into our respiratory system almost every time we breathe in, and these cilia really help propel that stuff back out. And the mucus that is secreted also helps trap that debris as well and push it back out of so it doesn't get down into our lungs. We clear our throats multiple times a day, sometimes hundreds of times a day. We don't even know it. And that's a function of the cilia and the mucus collecting debris and pushing it back out. All right, let's move on. I'm going to quickly talk about glandular epithelia, and we'll be done with the epithelial cells. So don't confuse this picture that I've drawn with what I'm about to state. We're onto a new category of epithelial tissue This just means the epithelial tissue that are involved with glands in the human body. And glands typically secrete products, so the functions are mostly just going to be secretion. The definition of a gland is basically one or more cells that synthesize and secrete a product. So we're talking about a cell or a group of cells that create or synthesize some sort of product and then release it, secrete it. That's the strict definition of a gland. The secretions typically are water-based, but not always. They can also be steroid or lipid-based, fat-based. So usually they're one or the other, either water-based secretions or lipid-based secretions, steroid-based secretions. The classifications major classifications of these types of glands is based on location, and that's location, I'm going to put of secretion, not of the gland itself, the location of the secretion and the number of cells. Okay. So the location of secretion, there are exocrine and endocrine glands. And number of cells, there's two groups. It's either unicellular or multicellular. Okay. I'll define for you really quickly the differences between exocrine and endocrine. An exocrine gland is a gland that secretes its product, typically a fluid, into a specific duct or tube that leads to the destination. So I'm just going to, for example, the liver is considered an exocrine gland. So I'm just going to draw a human liver here. I'll label it exo. The reason the liver is an exocrine gland is because it secretes a product, almost always a fluid. In this case, the fluid is called bile, B-I-L-E, and that fluid enters a tube or a duct. In this case, it's called the bile duct. So that fluid then is sent directly to its destination, which is the small intestine. So the reason that the liver is called an exocrine gland is because it secretes a product called bile that enters a duct, the bile duct, and then goes straight to its destination, which is, in this case, the small intestine. All right? That's very different from an endocrine gland. Endocrine gland always secretes hormones, which are chemical messengers. Yes, sometimes they're secreted with some sort of fluid, but the main product, so I'm going to write endo, always secretes hormones. Those hormones typically do not enter a tube or a duct like this one. The hormones then enter the bloodstream. Hormones are just chemical messengers. They enter the bloodstream and then they circulate all over the body. They don't go directly to their target site. They have to circulate everywhere the blood goes until they find their target site. So that's the main difference between exocrine and endocrine. So now I'm going to give you some examples of these, okay? Exocrine examples would be We already did the liver. Also, sweat glands are exocrine. Liver, pancreas, salivary glands. All of these secrete a product, typically a fluid, that enters some sort of tube or tube network that leads directly to its target site. We're not doing the endocrine system right now, but I'm just going to give you some examples. Endocrine examples would be like the thyroid, pituitary in the brain, adrenal glands, those, remember, they specifically secrete hormones that have to enter the bloodstream and circulate all over the body until they find their target cells. Now, I'm going to highlight a few things about exocrine glands. These can be unicellular or multicellular. That's talking about their structure. That just means single cell. That means more than one cell. Examples of unicellular exocrine glands would be things like goblet cells. Those are found mostly in the GI tract, in the digestive system, that's secretion of mucus, but also in the trachea as well. Plain, what we just call mucus cells. I'm going to tell you guys right now, you need to learn this as a sidebar. There's a difference between this word and this word. You're going to learn that this type of mucus, this is an adjective that describes the type of cell or gland that secretes this. This is the actual product. This is that sticky, watery based product that this is the product. And this is an adjective that typically describes the cell or gland that secreted it. So a mucus cell is a cell that actually secretes mucus. That's the product that it secretes. The OUS describes the secreting cell or cell. These secrete typically a lubricating fluid that is filled with mucus. Multicellular glands are typically made up of some sort of secretory component along with a duct itself. These can be simple. I'm not going to get too involved with this, or compound. I can draw one for you. A simple multicellular exocrine gland would look something like this. And the secretory cells are down here. So there's more than one secretory cell, and it secretes a fluid, and that fluid goes to its surface, like the surface of the skin in terms of a sweat gland. Compound just means, it's almost the same thing. It just means there's more complex pockets of secretory areas like this. So functionally, they're the same. The secretory cells are typically found down here, but there's just a more complex arrangement to the gland. Same functionally, though, they secrete their products into this main duct, and it leads to its surface. Before I leave glands altogether, two terms I want you to know: merocrine versus holocrine. We use these terms to describe glands. And it's based on not the structure of the gland or how many cells are in the gland, but it's based strictly on the type of secretion. Merocrine glands, by definition, they secrete by exocytosis, and the secretory cells are not damaged in the process of secretion. So in merocrine glands, the cells, the secretory cells, can keep secreting whatever fluid or whatever product they're secreting for the life of the cell. Holocrine glands are very different. During the secretory process, the cells actually rupture and are destroyed during the secretory process. So in order to release the product, the whole cell has to explode. So therefore we make, in holocrine glands, we constantly make new secretory cells because the actual cells themselves are destroyed in the secretory process. Examples of merocrine glands would be typical sweat glands on the surface of the body. Salivary glands in the mouth. Holocrine glands would be, they typically secrete a lipid-based product. Examples would be sebaceous glands, and I'll talk more about sebaceous glands when we actually study the skin, the integumentary system. These are oil glands that we find associated with hair follicles on the skin. All right, before I leave this mini lecture, I'm just going to get you started very quickly on connective tissues. We're finished with epithelial tissue. So let's just I'm going to talk for like 5 more minutes and do a brief introduction to connective tissues. Remember, this is the most abundant and most varied type of tissue in the human body. There are 4, this one is difficult because it's so complicated and there's so many different types. So I'll try to help you with the most difficult part of connective tissue is just organizing these tissues. It's categorizing them that becomes almost mind-numbing because there's so many different types. But there's 4 main classes of connective tissue. So let's start there. Something called connective, I'm going to write CT from here on out so I don't have to keep writing out connective tissue. There's a category or class called connective tissue proper. Second one, that is cartilage. Third one, bone. And fourth, fluid. I don't have time today to go over all 4 of these. I'll continue on Thursday. These are just 4 main classes of connective tissue. And we know what cartilage is. I'll describe it, don't worry, in detail. We pretty much know what bone is. And fluid, I'm going to tell you right now, is basically blood and lymph found in lymph vessels. This one, I'm going to just start getting your feet wet with connective tissue proper. This is probably the most complicated and confusing one to try to categorize. But before I do that, I'm just going to write, let's just do some common characteristics of all connective tissues. And we'll call it a day, okay? They all have, all of these connective tissues, as different as they are, have a common origin, and that means embryologically. They all come from an embryonic tissue called mesenchyme. When we are developing in utero from a zygote to an embryo and further on, very early on in life stages, we basically have common root, very few common root tissues. All connective tissues are derived from mesenchyme, which is the embryonic tissue that gives rise to all of these, believe it or not. These connective tissues have varying degrees of vascularity. That means blood supply. Some of these tissues have a very rich blood supply. Some of them have a very poor or almost non-existent blood supply. For example, cartilage, very, very little blood supply, almost none. Bone, on the other hand, is very richly vascularized, has a lot of blood vessels in it. And finally, all of these have some sort of non-living component to them called a matrix. So all connective tissues have a living cell component and a non-living, usually fibrous component called a matrix. All right, guys, I'm gonna cut it off here. If you have any questions, feel free to fire away. I will post this recording on the Canvas page in Module 2. I'll try to do that in the next 24 hours. So if you want to rewatch it, or if you missed anything, if you joined late, that's okay. Next meeting, which is 2 days from now on Thursday, we're going to continue with the connective tissues and try to plow through that as best we can. And I'll try to get you, if not completely through chapter 4, I'll try to get you as far as I can. Okay, just don't forget those lab exercises, and also keep in the back of your mind that we have our first lecture quiz this coming Monday, February 1st. So if you have any questions, just feel free to email me. And if you don't have any right now, I will see you in 2 days. Have a great day, okay?
All our assignments are due by the 1st this week, right?
Yeah, so it was a combination of Module 1 and Module 2. Those lab assignments are due Monday by midnight.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Bye, guys. Have a great day.
Bye.